And as promised, copies of the magazine, the Baffler, are here, and if you don't have one, don't leave tonight without one, and don't leave without taking out a subscription. Now, to introduce our guest, since I was in my late teens, growing up in the city, I would take the number 2 streetcar for 10 cents from our home in North Park down to Broadway, where there was an out-of-town newspaper stand. And with what little money I had, I would buy British broadsheets, and I would buy literary quarterlies. I've been reading them ever since. That's a long time. When George Plimpton, my great friend, who came to the City Club on 15 different occasions, he was the editor of the Paris Review for 50 years. And many people thought of it as certainly one of the world's greatest literary quarterlies. It never had more than 13,000 subscribers. Literary quarterlies are hugely important in our history. They're what I call the great literary underground of America. Some of our greatest writers have come, or first appeared in literary quarterlies, and they went on to write books and to have a huge impact upon this country. In my connection with the Boston Red Sox, I was at Barnes & Noble. I was in the literary magazine section, and I found this magazine, and I was hugely impressed. And I found out that its editor-in-chief lives in Boston. And so we have connected, and that's why he's here tonight. That's why he came to Denver. I hope this magazine has a long life and prospers greatly, and I have every confidence it will because of the brilliance of his editorship. He's a PhD in American history from the University of Rochester, taught at Harvard, but this is his life now. Welcome, please, Dr. John Summers.
Thank you. Wow. It's a lot of superlatives. It's a good feeling. We're very grateful to George and his eloquence and values, which are ours. It's true that I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is not Boston. And we work in New York. Eliza works out of our new New York publishing office. But I should really deny that I'm any kind of a dyed-in-the-wool, disreputable East Coast liberal or leftist with some kind of allergy to conservatism. What Ted Cruz calls the New York values. I can't let you believe that about me, because then you wouldn't know something important about, surprising about our magazine, The Baffler. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, Adams County, Pennsylvania, which includes Gettysburg. It's named after John Adams and has a very long and fervent anti-Jeffersonian, anti-Jacksonian tradition. It's one of the most settled, conservative areas of the country, so I later found out after I left. My father served as a Marine in Vietnam when I was born. My mother was a secretary, and neither one of them had gone to college. So for some reason, though, I went to college, and then I just kind of kept going. I acquired a bachelor's in history at college in Virginia called James Madison University. And then I went on and went to another Virginia college called George Mason, and I got a master's degree in history. There, as a matter of fact, I helped produce the first U.S. history textbook that was put on CD-ROM at exactly the moment that the internet obsoleted CD-ROMs. So I went on. I failed upward in the American fashion to go to the University of Rochester and to study for a doctorate in history. And then to compound this whole story, and to everybody's really shocked surprise, I got a half-time job teaching at Harvard. And this convinced my family that something must be going right. But little did they know. Because in 2008, along with millions of other Americans, the kind of bottom fell out in my so-called academic career. Two years after that, 2 years after the 2008 crisis, it became painfully clear that my failure as a college professor was going to be permanent. I got a really surprising phone call. It was the Baffler's founder and editor-in-chief, Thomas Frank. Some of you may know or have heard of Tom from his book, What's the Matter with Kansas? He was calling from his home in Washington. I had heard from Tom a few weeks before because I'd written an essay for the Baffler, and he had called me to inform me that although he had accepted it and he liked it very much, the magazine had abruptly lost its funding, and therefore he couldn't publish my essay or anybody else's. And I remember saying, well, that happens, how many times do you hear of a magazine going under? But on the second call, Tom wondered whether I might be interested to refound the magazine in Cambridge. That you don't hear very much. I'd never worked on a magazine before, much less run one, and I had precisely the same amount of experience starting a nonprofit foundation, which is to say 0. At that point, this was the fall of 2010, I was an assistant professor of history, a visiting assistant professor of history at Boston College, teaching a low-level survey course, making about a third of what I had been making at Harvard, and not having any benefits. Tom at that time was writing a column for the Wall Street Journal. He was their token liberal. We had some friends in common, and he had taken what I thought was a kind of unholy delight in an essay that I wrote about my career teaching at Harvard. And that's the essay that had pretty much cooked my goose in the academy. And if you want to get a laugh, it's called All the Privileged Must Have Prizes. So I heard myself saying yes to Tom. I stood up and I walked out of my office and I went down to the hall to talk to my department chair, and I quit. And since then, I'm happy to say and to tell you about tonight, a lot of really wonderful people. We've been trying to figure out how to marry what is essentially an 18th century idea, the general interest political literary periodical, to 21st century technologies. And lo and behold, the magazine's second act has become a source of regeneration, kind of a major and fast-growing repository of democratic values. It's enmeshed in a new culture which is beginning to emerge, thanks to a whole community, in fact, really born anew in its pages. Okay, so you have copies of the magazine. So what is it and how do we talk about it? You can say we are a loosely formulated, tightly run, independent-minded collective of disillusioned journalists and poets, underpaid artists and illustrators, closet utopians, ex-professors, partially disenfranchised philosophers. We're united not by any parties or dogmas or secular catechisms, but by dint of a sensibility that I hope will become clear when I'm finished and we can explore a little bit in conversation, I hope. The editorial program is a mix of social analysis, political observation, poems and stories, illustrations, jokes, prayers, and aphorisms. We don't maintain anything as fancy as a mission statement, but ever since Tom Frank founded the magazine in 1988, the motto has been the journal that blunts the cutting edge. And that prompts us to jab at the zeitgeist, the pop icons and the pet ideologies that produce such a misleading sense of progress, keep Americans, generally speaking, paralyzed and paranoid, halfway hysterical, and glibly counterintuitive. In addition to landing what we think of as productively unproductive jabs on the weak chin of the conventional wisdom, embodied, say, by what we would call the Washington Consensus. We also enjoy kicking back and limbering up and mulling over bigger questions, questions of more mythological proportions than cultural criticism usually takes up. Sex and power, work and play, friendship and politics, fashion and health, war, and family. In this sense, we're generalists. We have no specialty, and we have no niche. There's no subject we're afraid of, and we abide no sacred cows. As what you would call small d Democrats, we keep a very close eye on the money power, not only how it tends toward concentration, but also the way that it talks to itself, explains itself, justifies itself. To be in the magazine publishing business now, at a time when the art of public argument has collapsed and mainstream media has really shrunk, is among other things to seek a fresh, direct vocabulary, one that's capable of examining prejudices and assumptions, of providing relief from management gibberish, shaping and influencing public opinion, gaining the trusts of our readers by refusing to talk down to them. Otherwise, why bother? Born, as I mentioned, in 1988, at the dawn of the information age economy, the Baffler was then reborn in 2011 in the middle of a global recession. So what does that tell you about the magazine? It tells you that all along, the project, the people who have edited and written the magazine have been really passionately devoted to it, in thrall, I think, because of a conviction that keeps the project and other projects like it evergreen. We do this because we believe in the value of free expression in a democracy, the history-making power of the word. The Baffler, as I'm sure you've all figured out by now, is a playfully ironic title for a magazine. We don't actually aim to baffle you. Every time we give you one of our essays or pass out one of our issues, we're aiming to persuade you of something. So if you've encountered magazines that offer commentary on cultural affairs, you know they appeal to your reason or they invoke your conscience. And sometimes they do seem like they're trying either to frighten you or to guilt trip you into paying attention to them. We believe that literary journalism needn't be boring and shouldn't be joyless. That public prose engaged with collective values can at least occasionally rise to the level of discourse that is called satire. It's true that the heavy use of irony in our essays can sometimes produce an acerbic or sarcastic tone, one that can come off sometimes as a bit cynical. But nothing I'm here to tell you is actually further from the truth. Producing the Baffler is a mark of confidence and a real leap of faith, something we call the as-if attitude that's handed down by our pragmatic ancestors. To act as if today's America is a time and a place where an independent magazine like ours can directly change minds and drive social change, and you help make it so. And the as-if attitude is a bit dangerous because it kind of requires you to tell the difference between hope and fantasy. Magical thinking is what we sometimes criticize as a tendency in America. But it's a lot more satisfying than pessimism, and it's more responsible than being passive about it all. And it really is working. 2015 marked the year that we opened the publishing office for the first time in New York. We boosted our staff. We tore down the paywall on our website, and we fine-tuned our digital strategy, ringing up blog posts and what we call daily bafflements. We published 160 web-only essays, including a quite popular one called about the crossbreeding of the Labrador Retriever and poodles. Anybody want to guess the title? The Labradoodle Racket. So we're not immune from publishing animal photos on the web. Okay? But as the year wore on and Trumpism seized everybody's attention, we were busy producing the largest 3 issues in the Baffler's quarter-century history. One last spring on the rule of fashion, which we called Venus in Furs. One on the dance of violence and empathy, which we call Battle Hymns. And another on the family unit as a fulcrum for furthering economic inequality. We call that one the family that prays together, and that's praise with an E. That's 624 pretty handsome pages, we like to think, printed pages, evidence of art and criticism with a spine. at a time when no such thing is supposed to be possible. But it is. This year, we're upping the ante even more, moving for the first time to a quarterly publication schedule, and adding a new slate of web columnists. So this story, which I've sketched for you, is pretty much the polar opposite of what you normally hear happening to idealistic enterprises. Some of you must be wondering by now, how in the world this particular idealistic enterprise gets funded in the first place. You might be more curious if I tell you how stubborn and principled we are about the whole thing. Unlike the great majority of literary magazines, the Baffler is not a plaything of any wealthy benefactor, nor is it a tool of any university writing program. Unlike the great majority of online magazines and blogs, we pay all of our contributors, and unlike every other content provider, I'm trying to get the content provider out. We don't take ads, we don't use interns, we don't give prizes, and we don't accept government money. We're independent. As a 501c3 tax-deductible foundation, we depend on a heterogeneous circle of people to sustain the work. Among the supporters are actors and comedians, film producers, video game designers, playwrights, smattering of professors and lawyers and tech entrepreneurs. Everyone, I assure you, with very good taste. The members of our circle, which I hope you may consider joining, share an understanding of the intangible value of unbought writing and opinion. They feel the power of education and information in a democracy. They see often that in the market culture, financial transactions, including increasingly those in higher education and in philanthropy, are caught up in a kind of grasping language of investment. Equity is called stakeholding. Impact is measured in the short term and constantly. But we're not selling stakes. We're part of a gift economy. Equality, not equity, is the thing that fires us up. Appreciation, recognition, and trust, rather than immediate return on investment, form the nimbus of our community. What's it worth to stop a cliche in its tracks? To translate a bureaucratic euphemism into ordinary speech? To report on the shocking failures of the Los Angeles family court system? If you've gaped at the numbing parade of scandals on your screen, or wondered why innovation is the word of the age, or tried to guess what open source software actually means, or got annoyed the 500th time you've read or heard a mayor praising the vibrancy of a neighborhood, we're here for you. We've looked into these things. How do you measure the impact of a sensibility that can claim to decode cliches? It's a very difficult question. But consider a counterexample. A sensibility manufactured for the narrow purpose of obfuscation at the expense of public information. It's surely one of recent history's richest ironies that the conservative businessmen who live and breathe the jargon of dividends have gamed the nonprofit sector, in which we now work, learned how to use the mechanisms there, tax policy, outside the market economy to advance their interests. Much is made of Donald Trump's wizardry in producing new political realities, but Trump is, as I'm sure many of you would agree, only the especially gaseous product of a donor-funded convergence of power and intellectual capital that's been present in conservative movement since before Ronald Reagan. It's a war of ideas, they cried, while building a whole arsenal of magazines, publishers, radio and television shows, speaking bureaus, websites, think tanks, and an all-star team of public intellectuals. Brand names from the editor and writer William F. Buckley Jr. to Trump supporter Ann Coulter. All Trump himself has done is to take the logic of the donor-driven content to its next step and put himself up. We argue in the magazine something like this. The ultimate aim of this conservative, donor-funded ideology has been to rewrite the rules by which American popular thought is judged, to produce a world in which democratic alternatives to the money power don't seem to be possible because all of its major premises appear natural and unquestioningly legitimate. Most of us, just for example, know what the rat race means when you hear it, but the official word from the nation's economists is that the hyper-competitive style of life and its many miseries and inequalities are glitches, temporary abnormalities in an otherwise sound system, pathologies originating from within a maladjusted individual. The heavenly market, they all agree, is the best possible mechanism for distributing profits justly and efficiently, for separating the winners from the losers, just as the three parts of government are supposed to check the concentration of power. Well, remember, overturning these fairy tales was the breakthrough of progressive social thought and the predicate for the New Deal and the Great Society. Liberals and progressives entered modern political life by discovering society as a realm of obligation, bridging economics and politics. The market as a component of institutions that could be democratically controlled to enhance the life chances of all of society's members. For more than a half century now, the plutocrats have showered Babylonian sums on nonprofit institutions whose mission is attacking democratic forms of control over the prerogatives of big business. This revolution in reverse of the post-war liberal consensus could never have won an open competition of ideas without Pete Peterson, whose foundations worked over the years to transform what was called social insurance into entitlements, which is something that the President Barack Obama now calls them. Sheldon Adelson, whose name I'm sure you know, who harasses and viciously sabotages journalists when he's not secretly purchasing newspapers. And Charles and David Koch, whose armies of hacks and hirelings suborned science. And his father, as we've recently learned, built an oil refinery for the Nazis. That's impact. It took the idea of social insurance for the old and the weak more than 40 years after it was first formulated at the University of Wisconsin to be realized in New Deal legislation, only now to see it rebranded as an entitlement. African Americans who marched on Washington in 1941 waited 25 years for the Voting Rights Act. It's taken the Supreme Court fairly short order to eviscerate it. Impact. History is full of surprises and reversals and long periods of waiting. The main question is, what are you doing now? What are your values? What are you willing to struggle for, to argue for? An older question that has long rallied people like us, which side are you on? The magazine is that conversation. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for having this choice to make. The Baffler is a beautiful creature for absorbing the superfluous people in the country like myself. Those who are searching for homes for their values and some direction for their intuitions. How often, ask yourself, is a writer able to speak in a direct, honest, and conversational voice, while also attempting to rise above personal experience to get at something larger in the culture? Taking the time to consider, to reconsider, to rework, and to revise, to think while writing. That any magazine still exists for this purpose, I thought, must result from some mysterious intercession, some equivalent to the invisible hand that caused the end of history to change its mind, maybe, to allow for an exception. But maybe it goes to show that the conventional notion of a career, strange amalgamation of compromises and skills that once stood for a stable job in a middle-class society, is the thing that's become superfluous. Maybe instead of a career or a profession, we should think more about older, radically conservative words like calling and like vocation. Things that unite our passions with our interests and which suggest sensibility. Instead of whining about our alienation and our discontent and shaking our fists at the pundits as if we ourselves are looking for some kind of master key for history, we should embrace maybe the entrepreneur's faith in the ambiguities of the future. Something usually turns up. So that's my humble opinion. I think that just under the surface of our official culture lies a renaissance in critical thinking. I think you should ignore the pessimists and assess the trend spotters at a pretty heavy discount when they tell you that Americans are too stupid for democracy. They don't really read, that they don't care, that they don't know what's going on. They do. They read the Baffler. I hope you do too.
Well, that was terrific. Now we'll have just a brief time of dialogue. If you have a comment and or a question, don't be shy. Anyone? Anyone? You must have been incredibly convincing. Does the Baffler have a right? Oh,
George. I was just asking,
Sue, I'm sorry.
how does your father feel about what you're doing now? Is he comfortable with it?
Repeat it.
How does my father feel about it? Well, I'm sorry to say that he passed away this past summer. So, but before that, it was a fraught relationship over the kind of thing I just said, which he didn't agree with.
Yeah.
And
That's why I asked. I had a feeling.
yeah, and I feel in many ways that just privately that I can contain both sides of the polarized debate because of this experience, and then hopping on the other side of things for a bit and taking bits and pieces. But he, I think it confused him.
He couldn't get to the being proud part.
Oh, of course he was. No, he was very gracious and very kind and about it. But well, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters. I mean, there's always a generational question, but there's a geographic question as well. And where I'm from is, and where he was part of and was born and raised, is a agricultural, a rural community. So it's a hard question because it's something I think about all the time.
Donnell.
In relationship to youth and both reaching them at a maturity level where they could engage with the concepts and helping them become the kind of citizens that would.
Yeah.
Is that part of your bigger picture? Where do youth fit?
We were in Denver just the other day, and we had some high school students who were all going to college and had some pretty interesting questions about what awaited them. And I was able to tell them that based on my bumbling and low sense of self-consciousness about what I was doing, now that I know how educational institutions treat these kind of students, which is often crushing debt and not much on the other side in terms of jobs, that they really ought to think carefully about how they were going to approach their education. And they're not going to read and understand everything at that age that we're publishing, but they're going to read something, and maybe it'll be a poem or a graphic, or they'll catch the sensibility, and they'll remember that when they ask these kind of hard questions, there's some kind of group of people that's going to give them an answer that's not vested in some way, that's going to just assess the experience, synthesize the responses, and give it to them as carefully as we can and as honestly as we can. So it was a good conversation we had.
Carol.
I'm curious to know how you make your choices each quarter for your public, for what you are going to include. Do you have an editorial board? I mean, I don't even know how newspapers do this.
Well, there really isn't this, how we put together each issue, what's the structure.
Not so much the choices you make. And I would say the philosophy that influences you. I mean, you've spoken of the philosophy, but yeah, I guess the procedure.
Well, we have a number of editors. We've invested in our editors. We hire editors. We train them. We have all the apparatus that that the Partisan Review had developed 50 years ago, and because we're working in this certain kind of tradition, and we want to see what kind of editorial talent and intelligence that we can develop. So we have conversations all the time, and we're all each engaged with different parts of them. Every issue has a theme. So this issue was on violence and empathy. We started out the summer issue that is thinking about, well, we wanted to do something on empathy. We thought that was a kind of, but that really means just a way of organizing the kind of questions we're asking all the time. So we go out and we look for writers that are working in areas that we think might be fruitful, and some of them we write ourselves. Then we chose family and worked that out because, I had a family issue, so we decided to try to sort of, it's a kind of personal expression by the staff in many ways, meeting up with topics, bigger problems, and an audience behind it. So there's a level of idiosyncrasy behind every issue.
I'll ask a question. Is there a literary magazine now published, whether it's Sewanee or Virginia Quarterly or New England or Antioch? Is there one in particular that you like or admire?
We have lots of friends in the field. Agni magazine it's a wonderful literary magazine that's published out of Boston University, and they do a lot of translation work, and we learn from them, and also try to pick up writers that we hadn't heard about before. They're more of a straightforward literary production. Ours is a literary magazine that has a political and a larger cultural argument and context behind it. But that's a fine magazine. Boston Review, Lapham's Quarterly in New York. N+1 is another example of a journal. There are lots of interesting people who are now flocking to this corner of the world. Yes.
Now I have another question. You do keep talking about Boston and New York, and I read the New Yorker and can never forget the famous cover that shows the main part of the world is all New York, and then you have little tiny parts that are the West and so on. And that feels like what most literary journals do, is they focus on the eastern seaboard intelligentsia. So how are you addressing the rest of us?
Well, you can tell me what I'm missing because I'm right here. So I'm happy to have that conversation. But we have subscribers in all 50 states and all over Europe, and writers also who live elsewhere. And we cover secessionist movements in Louisiana and the LA court system, and we have a columnist who writes from Chicago. It's more difficult. It's not so hard to cover geographically and have the national argument. It's more difficult, I guess, to figure out what the international aspect of it is, because it's more hit or miss. But we don't restrict our coverage to the East Coast cities at all. So there's lots of content we can show you.
Dr. Broad.
The usual audience that something like this would get could be kind of segmentally dissected out a little bit, but certainly one group would be young college people. That they would like to hear this stuff before they get crushed. And but these days, with the young college people under incredible economic pressure, time pressure, competitive pressure, do you find that group of people simply isn't as responsive because they just don't have the time and that they're too focused on making it? I mean, it would seem that this would be a big audience that's truly being threatened, so that they're not going to be receptive to these ideas in the way that they perhaps used to in more intellectually free society.
Well, well, we'd like not to think that's the case. We find something really interesting with college students. First of all, it's worth remembering that, as I'm sure you know, that college students are almost always been conservative in this country. It's only the experience of the 30s and then the experience of the 60s where college students had ever become a force of mass mobilized political activity. Usually the expectation is that they're busy, just like you're saying. There's a cultural malaise that stems from their personal transformations, but they don't really have time for politics, not much for social change. The economic situation in which most college students find themselves now is pretty bleak. And it's a challenge, I think, to try to dislodge or to introduce to them a new concept that catches up with the current experience. So I'll just give you one example. We have a friend at Wesleyan University, which is in Connecticut, and he was thinking that maybe we should go and talk about college debt, student debt, because lots of them are in debt. It's a very expensive school. This is a few years ago. And we had the conversation. We didn't go there, but we were developing the conversation. And word came back that the students weren't really interested in anybody proposing free college. They thought that that was a little bit gauche. That, what were you trying to get away with? Somebody who proposes free college is clearly trying to skip out on a system that they recognize as no alternatives to, right? It's too far out there. What we found is that, or what we heard, is that they regard the acquisition of student debt as a right of maturity. It's growing up, the same way that their parents acquired a mortgage. I mean, that's a challenge. But it doesn't mean that they're all not receptive. It doesn't mean that they won't be. It doesn't mean that there won't be, with every new graduating class, more prospects for students who are under a lot of debt or who are just dissatisfied with their choices or don't like the direction of the country and look for something to read. They're not going to look for another blog. The age of blogs is finished. I mean, that era is over. Digital journalism is extremely conservative. People are going back to print. These essays are designed for, many of the longer essays are designed to be read in print. It's nice to sort of, look at paper again. It's not entirely a rediscovery because books never went away. We were told that books were going away, remember? We were told that nobody was going to read books anymore. It's not true. The ebook market is pretty much plateaued, and the print books, I mean, there's problems on the other end of the production. We're under a kind of monopoly system of book production. It's mostly German-owned, but that's a whole other problem. But people read. There's a great and vast marketplace full of readers. And those who enjoy reading and take pleasure in reading, thinking and arguing, and people who would read along because they're interested in an author or a specific topic, and then they will encounter a poem. And they will remember, oh yes, I remember I read a poem when I was in high school in English class, and what's that like now? Maybe I might like it. And our presupposition is always that this reader that we have might be interested in the poem or in looking for more than a glance at one of our illustrations or reading a short story. It's a compliment, we think, to our readers to assume that there's this interest, and I think that there is. Our challenge is to find them and to identify them and convert them.
Let me, before we express our appreciation to John and to Eliza, make sure you have a copy of the magazine, but this may be our last time to see, for a while, Jessica Wilson. Jessica has been a part of our life since she was a junior at La Jolla Country Day. She went to Tufts. She was the commencement speaker at Tufts. She was born in Cairo, an Egyptian mother. Her father was in the United States Army. She is fluent in Arabic, reads and writes. She's been hired by Homeland Security. And before too many weeks have passed, will be moving to Washington, and she will be one of the great, great additions to any national government agency, and that's the great Jessica right over there. So, thank you for coming. We just loved having AIA here. Salt Lake, Reston, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, how terrific. and all of you for coming, and we will see you for Governor and Mrs. Dukakis on the 6th, and for Jim Wallace on the 14th. Thank you all.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you, George.